My father-in-law gave a speech at our wedding. I want you to understand that I didn't know it was coming. Nobody warned me. Not my husband, not his mother, not the event coordinator who'd been with us all day. One moment I was sitting at the head table in the dress I'd spent 4 months searching for, holding my husband's hand, thinking that this was the happiest day of my life. And then Richard stood up and clinked his glass. He talked for 11 minutes. I know because I have the video. I've watched it exactly once, 2 years after the wedding, just to confirm that what I remembered was accurate and not something my brain had exaggerated over time. It was not exaggerated. At the 7-minute mark, he looked directly at me across the room and said, and I'm quoting, "I just want my son to know that the people who love him most will always be watching out for him. Some people come into a family for the right reasons, and some people come in for other reasons. Time has a way of showing us which is which." He raised his glass. The room went very quiet. My husband's hand tightened on mine. That was my wedding day. My name is Claire. I'm 37. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist, which means I spend my days helping children with developmental challenges learn how to navigate the world. It's work that requires patience and the ability to see potential where other people see limitation. I have thought about that irony many times when it comes to Richard. My husband, Daniel, is 40. He's a software architect, thoughtful, introverted, the kind of person who takes 3 days to respond to a text message, but will drop everything for someone he loves. We met at a friend's birthday party when I was 28. He spilled a drink on my jacket, apologized 4 times, and then spent the next hour talking to me about child development research in a way that made it clear he'd actually read something about it, not just asked as a conversation starter. I was done for. Completely done for. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on an ordinary Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen. No grand gesture, just, "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I want to marry you," and a ring he'd had his grandmother resize. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Daniel's family. His mother, Patricia, warm and soft-spoken, someone I genuinely loved from the first time I met her. His younger sister, Megan, a veterinarian, funny and direct. And Richard. Richard is 67, retired civil engineer, built his own company, sold it at 55, and has been coasting on the proceeds and his own mythology ever since. He is the kind of man who believes his success is entirely the result of his own excellence, and not at all the result of circumstance, timing, and the fact that he was a white man with a good education building a company in a booming industry in the 1990s. He loved Daniel with the particular intensity of a man who had put a lot of himself into his son and wanted to see a return on that investment. Not financially. Richard wasn't mercenary. He wanted Daniel to be exactly what Richard had imagined for him. A specific kind of successful, a specific kind of settled, with a specific kind of woman. I was not, apparently, that kind of woman. I grew up in a working-class family in rural Tennessee. My father was a mechanic. My mother worked at a hospital reception desk. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either, and I went to college on loans and scholarships and the particular determination of someone who understood that education was a lever and she needed to use it. I had student loans when I met Daniel. I had a small apartment and a 10-year-old car, and a job I loved that paid reasonably but not extravagantly. Daniel, by comparison, had inherited money from his grandfather, owned a condo, and had a salary that was more than twice mine. Richard did the math. The math, in his mind, was damning. To be fair, and I've worked hard over the years to be fair about Richard, he didn't start with the gold digger accusation. He started with questions. Reasonable questions, framed as concern, delivered with the particular skill of a man who had been managing perceptions for decades. What exactly does occupational therapy pay? At a family dinner 6 months in. And your loans, are those manageable? Daniel mentioned you were still paying those off. Over Thanksgiving. I just want to understand your situation, Claire. I think it's important that families are transparent with each other. The word transparent, while asking about my financial history to determine whether I was after his son's money. I answered all of them, politely, directly. I had nothing to hide, and I figured that openness would eventually satisfy him. It didn't, because the questions were never really about information. They were about positioning, about establishing, in Daniel's presence and gradually in the family's consciousness, a frame through which I could be viewed. The frame was, this woman comes from less. This woman needs more than she has. This woman is with my son for reasons we should examine carefully. Daniel saw some of it. He pushed back when things were explicit. Dad, that's not appropriate. Dad, that's enough. But Richard was good enough at ambiguity that half the time what he'd said could be read as genuine concern rather than accusation, and Daniel would end up frustrated without having a clear target. I didn't tell Daniel everything. That's something I've examined in therapy. The ways I protected him from the full picture because I didn't want to make him choose, because I knew what it would cost him to choose, and because some part of me still believed I could earn my way out of Richard's suspicion by simply being undeniably, incontrovertibly myself. That was naive. You cannot earn your way out of a prejudice that is about what you represent rather than who you are. The engagement announcement was met by Richard with a conversation he requested with Daniel alone. I wasn't there. Daniel told me afterward that his father had asked him to consider a prenuptial agreement. I said, "And what did you say?" Daniel said, "I said no. And I said that if he brought it up again, he wouldn't be invited to the wedding." He hadn't brought it up again, but the speech had apparently been Plan B. The 7 days after the wedding were some of the strangest of my life. We went on our honeymoon, a week in Costa Rica that Daniel had planned meticulously, and that was genuinely beautiful. We hiked and swam and ate good food and tried to just be two people who had chosen each other in front of everyone they loved. But the speech was there. Not constantly, not ruinously, but there, the way a splinter is there. Mostly you forget it. Occasionally you move a certain way and it reminds you. When we got back, Patricia called me privately. She'd never done that before. She said, "Claire, I'm so sorry. I want you to know that what Richard said, that wasn't acceptable, and I told him that." "Thank you," I said. "He doesn't see it the way you do," she said. "He thinks he was being protective. I know he thinks that. He's going to need time." I said, "Patricia, with respect, I'm not sure time is the right frame for this. He said those things at my wedding, in front of our guests. Time is for misunderstandings. This was a choice." She was quiet for a moment. "You're right," she said. "You're right. I don't know how to fix it." "You don't have to fix it. I'm not asking you to fix it. What I was asking, though I didn't say it then, was for it to be named. For someone in that family to say out loud, Richard said something at the wedding that was wrong. And not just poorly timed or phrased badly, but wrong at its foundation. I wanted someone to say that the accusation itself The framing of me as a woman who had married for money was untrue and unfair and had caused real damage. Nobody said exactly that. Not then. Richard called Daniel a week after we got home. Daniel told me about the call. Richard said he'd been misunderstood, that he'd been speaking generally, not specifically, that if Claire had taken it personally, he was sorry for that. If Claire had taken it personally. The conditional, the passive construction, the shift of the problem from what he'd said to how I'd received it. Daniel said, I needed to call Claire and apologize directly. Richard said, I think you're making too much of this. They didn't speak for 3 weeks. That was the longest they'd gone without talking in Daniel's adult life. And I was always aware, of the cost of that silence. Richard eventually called and said something that functioned as an apology, if you squinted at it from the right angle. Daniel accepted it. Life moved on. But Richard and I never recovered. The civility was real. We were civil at every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday dinner for 5 years. But it was the civility of two people who have been to war and established a ceasefire, and both know exactly why the war happened. He never said he'd been wrong about me. Not once. In 5 years. The math he'd done in his head, the calculation that I was a woman who had married up for financial reasons, he had never revised it. I knew this because of the way he watched me. Not hostilely, just watchfully, like he was still waiting for the evidence to arrive that would prove him right. I kept being myself. I kept working my job I loved. I kept being good to Daniel, and good to Patricia, and good to Megan. I kept showing up. And I kept waiting, without meaning to, without wanting to, for something to shift. Richard had a stroke in November of the 4th year of our marriage. It was a Thursday evening. Patricia called Daniel, who called me, and we drove to the hospital together without saying much. The stroke was moderate. He'd lost some function on his left side, some speech clarity, but the prognosis with therapy was reasonably good. The key word there is therapy, specifically occupational therapy. The hospital assigned him a therapist, a competent man named James, and Richard made some initial progress. But the commute to the outpatient facility was difficult for Patricia to manage. The insurance coverage was complicated. And at a family meeting about 6 weeks post-stroke, the question came up of what the next phase of his care would look like. Patricia looked at me across the table. I think she'd been thinking about it for a while. She said, carefully, Claire, I don't want to put you in an awkward position, but I wanted to ask, is there anything you could offer? In terms of guidance? Not professionally, I understand that's its own thing, but just... I said, I'll work with him. Patricia said, Claire, he's Daniel's father. I'll work with him. Daniel looked at me. I looked back at him. Something passed between us that I don't have the language for. And so I started going to Richard's house twice a week. I want to describe what those early sessions were like because I think the texture of it matters. Richard could not fully meet my eyes at first. Not because of the stroke, his visual field was fine, because of what had happened between us. He'd sit in the chair and we'd work through the exercises and he'd say, thank you, in the clipped way of a man who finds gratitude difficult. And I'd say, you're doing well, in the calm professional way of someone who has separated the work from the personal. We didn't talk about the wedding for weeks. We talked about his recovery, his goals. He wanted to drive again, he wanted to be able to play chess with his neighbor, he wanted his handwriting back. Specific, achievable things. The things that mattered to him. I helped him get there. Not because of any wisdom about forgiveness or redemption, because that's my job, because I am good at my job, and because somewhere underneath all of it, I believed, and had always believed, that people deserve the help they need regardless of what they've done to you. About 8 weeks in, we were at the kitchen table doing fine motor exercises when Richard said, without looking up from the task, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "What do you mean?" "I was not kind to you." Still not looking up. "At the wedding. In general. I was not kind to you." I didn't say anything. "You don't owe me anything." He paused. "I know that." I said, "You're right. I don't." He looked up then. The stroke had done something to his face. Not disfigured it, but softened it somehow. Stripped away some of the controlled authority that had always been his default expression. He looked older. He looked uncertain. He said, "I was wrong about you." 3 sentences. No conditional, no passive construction. I was wrong about you. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I know you were." I want to be clear about something. I did not take satisfaction in Richard's stroke. I want to say that plainly because I know it would be easy to read this story as some kind of cosmic revenge arc, and it wasn't that. What happened to Richard was painful and frightening and difficult for everyone in the family, including me. I was genuinely scared when he first collapsed. I drove to that hospital thinking about Daniel and Patricia and what this could mean, and at no point did I think, good. The satisfaction, if that's even the right word, came later. It came slowly. It came in small increments over those months of working with him. Because what I watched happen to Richard was not punishment. It was education. He had spent years watching me through a lens he'd decided on before he knew me. And then, suddenly, he was in a position where he had to be helped, where the help was available in the form of a woman he'd misjudged, where he had to sit in a room with that woman twice a week and watch her do her job well and receive something from her. There's a thing that happens sometimes in therapy, in occupational therapy, in all kinds of therapy, where the work creates intimacy. Not romantic intimacy, just the intimacy of one person seeing another person at a point of real vulnerability and not flinching. Richard had never been vulnerable in front of me. For 5 years, he'd been watchful and controlled and certain. Now he was learning to hold a pen again in front of the woman he'd called a gold digger. That's a reckoning. Not a punishment, a reckoning. He made his amends in the way someone makes amends when they are not comfortable with grand gestures. He started saying my name at family dinners. Before that, he'd often spoken about me in a sentence that avoided it. He asked about my work. He asked in the way of someone who is newly interested, who has revised an old understanding and is following the thread of the revision. Megan told me, on a walk we took together one Sunday, that Richard had said something to her about me. She said he'd said, "I underestimated Claire. I made a mistake about her from the beginning." He hadn't said it to me, but Megan had told me, which meant he'd known she would. That's its own kind of communication. Richard finished his formal recovery program about a year after the stroke. He drives again, short distances, with Patricia, but he drives. His handwriting is close to what it was. He and his neighbor play chess on Thursdays. I still go over sometimes. Not for therapy, just as family. He makes coffee. We sit at the kitchen table. We talk about Daniel, about Megan's new practice, about whatever. Normal things. He's never given another speech at a family event. I think about the wedding sometimes. Not with the same sharpness I used to. The splinter has worked its way out, mostly. But I remember the room going quiet and my husband's hand tightening on mine, and the particular feeling of sitting in your wedding dress and realizing that someone has decided who you are and intends to say so publicly. I remember deciding in that moment not to leave the table, not to cry, not to respond, not to give the room a scene. To sit there in my dress and let the speech end and let the dinner resume and be, simply, the person I was. That decision cost me something. And it also, I've come to understand, demonstrated something that no direct argument could have demonstrated. Not to Richard in that moment, but over time to the people in that room who were watching, and eventually to Richard himself. Daniel and I just bought a bigger house. 4 bedrooms, a yard, a kitchen that needs work. We've been talking about what we want the next chapter to look like. And for the first time in a while, those conversations feel easy. Like we're building something from a shared foundation. Megan is coming over to help us paint the living room next Saturday. Patricia is making her brisket and bringing it over in a pot because that's what Patricia does. Richard is coming too. He offered to help with the painting, which, at 67, with residual left side weakness, is both logistically inadvisable and exactly the kind of thing that tells you something has changed. I told him we'd find him an important job. He said, "Don't give me a fake job." I said, "I know better than that." He almost smiled. That's where we are. Not a fairy tale, not a complete transformation. 2 people who have a complicated history and have found their way to something that functions like respect. I'll take it. Before you go, I want to sit with something for just a moment. Richard decided who I was before he knew me. He built a theory. Poor girl, wealthy son, obvious calculation. And he held it for years against all evidence to the contrary, because the theory was more comfortable than the revision. Here's what I've learned. You cannot argue someone out of a prejudice they hold about you. Not directly. Argument feeds the narrative. It makes you seem defensive, which confirms the suspicion. The only thing that works, eventually, is time and presence and being undeniably, consistently yourself. It's slow. It's unfair. It requires you to keep showing up for people who haven't shown up for you. But here's the other thing I know. The person who benefits most from that persistence is not the one who misjudged you. It's you. Because the version of yourself you build in the process of refusing to become what someone decided you were, that version is unshakable. And that's worth something that no wedding speech can take away.